One of Tina Turner's children died before his mother could fully understand why he was gone. One spent his final years carrying the Turner name while barely speaking to the woman who raised him. One became a musician like his parents, only to die after years of serious health problems. And one disappeared so completely from public life that remarkably little is known about where he is today. The names were Craig, Ike Jr., Michael, and Ronnie. For boys raised inside one of the most famous and most troubled families in music history. Their father figure was Ike Turner, the man whose musical partnership with Tina made them international stars, but whose abuse would eventually drive Tina to flee their marriage. And while the world watched Tina transform herself from a battered wife into one of the biggest solo performers on earth, her sons were growing up inside the aftermath. The first of Tina's children was Raymond Craig Hill, later known as Craig Raymond Turner. He was born on August 20th, 1958, in California, when Tina was only 18 years old. His father was Raymond Hill, a saxophonist who performed with Ike Turner's Kings of Rhythm. Craig arrived before Tina became the global superstar the world would eventually know, but his childhood quickly became connected to Ike. When Tina married Ike in 1962, Ike adopted Craig, and Craig became part of the household that would eventually produce the legendary Ike and Tina Turner Revue. And that meant Craig wasn't growing up in an ordinary home. He was growing up around rehearsals, musicians, touring, fame, and increasingly violence. Tina later revealed that her marriage to Ike was deeply abusive. She described physical assaults, psychological abuse, and years of fear. Craig was a child inside that environment. But unlike his mother, he never became interested in turning that pain into a public story. He eventually built a quiet adult life in California and worked in real estate. Then, on July 3rd, 2018, everything changed. Craig was found dead at his home in Studio City, California. He was 59. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner determined that he died by suicide from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Tina was devastated. She was in France when the news reached her. Later, she returned to California and held a private ceremony for her son. She scattered his ashes into the Pacific Ocean. She described it as one of the saddest moments of her life. But perhaps the most haunting part of Craig's story is how little the public actually knew about the man behind a famous surname. There were no years of television interviews explaining his childhood in a tell-all book. No attempt to become famous because of his mother. Craig simply lived quietly, and then he was gone. But Craig wasn't the only son whose life was permanently shaped by the complicated world Tina had escaped. The next one had a very different relationship with her. The son who said Tina wasn't speaking to him. Ike Turner Jr. was born in 1958 to Ike Turner and Lorraine Taylor. Tina wasn't his biological mother. But after marrying Ike, she adopted Ike Jr. and his brother Michael. For Ike Jr., that distinction apparently mattered less than the reality of his childhood. Tina raised him. Years later, he said she was the only mother he had ever known. And Ike Jr. inherited the musical instincts of the family. He worked as a musician and sound engineer and briefly worked with Tina after she left Ike. But their professional relationship did not last. Ike Jr. later claimed that his biological father interfered with his ability to continue working for Tina. And as the years passed, the relationship between Ike Jr. and Tina became increasingly distant. By 2018, Ike Jr. publicly said he had not spoken to Tina in nearly 2 decades. Think about how complicated that is. The woman who raised you becomes one of the most celebrated survivors in entertainment history. The world sees her as an inspirational figure. But privately, you're telling reporters that you haven't spoken to her in years. Ike Jr. nevertheless continued working in music. And ironically, one of his biggest professional achievements came through the man whose complicated legacy had helped fracture the family in the first place. Ike Jr. worked with his father. In 2007, he won a Grammy Award as a producer on Ike Turner's album Risin' with the Blues. His father died that same year. Ike Sr. was 76 and had struggled with serious substance abuse problems. Tina had escaped him decades earlier, but his sons had never been able to escape the Turner name. Then, years later, another tragedy arrived. On October 4th, 2025, Ike Turner Jr. died at a hospital in Los Angeles. He had just turned 67 the previous day. His family said he had battled severe heart problems for years and had suffered a stroke in September. His reported cause of death was kidney failure. He had survived his father. He had survived the complicated relationship with Tina. He had even won a Grammy. But he ultimately became the second of Tina's children to die after Craig. And suddenly, the family had only 2 sons left. One of them had spent much of his life around music. His name was Ronnie, the son who followed his parents into music. Ronnie Turner was born on October 27, 1960. Unlike Craig, Ike Jr., and Michael, Ronnie was Tina's biological child with Ike Turner. He was born into the height of the Ike and Tina Turner era. His parents were performing around the world. Their records were selling. Their stage shows were becoming legendary. But Ronnie's childhood also existed inside the chaos of his parents' marriage. And eventually, that marriage collapsed. In 1976, Tina walked away from Ike after another violent confrontation. She reportedly left with only 36 cents and a mobile gas card. The divorce was finalized in 1978. Tina then rebuilt her career from the ground up. Ronnie remained connected to music. He played bass and performed with musicians, and in 1979, he toured with his mother. But his life was not always stable. Tina later acknowledged that she had serious concerns about Ronnie's choices and his struggles. Eventually, however, he found a quieter life. In 2007, Ronnie married French singer Affida Turner, and for a while, things seemed relatively settled. Then came the diagnosis nobody expected. On December 8, 2022, Ronnie died at his home in California. He was only 62. Initial reports said he had suffered breathing difficulties. Later, the cause became clearer: metastatic colon carcinoma, cancer that had spread through his body. Cardiovascular disease was also listed as a contributing factor. Tina was still alive when Ronnie died. She was devastated. She publicly mourned him, describing him as her beloved son and saying he had left the world far too early. But there was something especially cruel about the timing. Craig had already died 4 years earlier. Now Ronnie was gone too, and Tina had lost 2 of her 4 children. She would die only 5 months later. On May 24, 2023, Tina Turner died at her home in Küsnacht, Switzerland, at the age of 83. The woman who had spent decades rebuilding herself had finally reached the end of her extraordinary life. But one son was still alive, and his story is perhaps the most mysterious of all: the son who almost disappeared. Michael Turner was born around 1960 to Ike Turner and Lorraine Taylor. Like Ike Jr., he was adopted by Tina. But unlike his famous siblings, Michael largely disappeared from public life. There is very little reliable information about what he has done in recent decades, and that appears to be intentional. Reports over the years have described health and addiction struggles, and in 2018, he was reported to be living in a care facility. Tina was reportedly still involved in supporting him financially, but there is no dramatic Hollywood comeback story. No Grammy, no major acting career, no attempt to become a celebrity because of his famous family. Just a man who grew up inside one of the most recognizable households in America and eventually chose a life almost completely outside the public eye. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about Tina Turner's children. None of them became Tina Turner. 4 sons, for completely different lives. Craig became a private real estate professional before his tragic death at 59. Ike Jr. became a musician and Grammy-winning producer before dying from kidney failure in 2025. Ronnie inherited his parents' musical talent, performed with his mother, and eventually died from metastatic cancer at 62. Michael largely disappeared from public view, and now the family that once included 4 sons has been reduced to 1 surviving child. There is something almost surreal about looking at old photographs of Tina surrounded by her boys. At the time, they were simply children. They couldn't have known that their mother would eventually become a symbol of survival. They couldn't have known that their father would become one of the most controversial figures in music history.